Hello, learners, and welcome to the NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In this lecture, we will have reached the end, finally, once and for all, our discussion of the life and work of the poet Langston Hughes. We have been discussing a special category of poems by Langston Hughes titled The Lynch or the Lynching Poems. I have described how this category of poems allows us to witness a very particular and unique combination of skills, the history of the African American community, and a growing consciousness and use of race in poetic form. I have described that Hughes's particular synthesis of the blues song as well as the poetic tradition of the elegy enables Hughes to undertake a particularly powerful form of collective grieving, and we can witness such collective grieving at its most poignant, sophisticated, and profound shape in these lynching poems. We have discussed three lynching poems, A Song for a Brown Girl, and then Silhouette and Blue Bayou. We will now read what I consider to be Hughes's finest, most powerful lynch poem, but also elegy. This is a poem that's titled The Bitter River. In order to set up our understanding of this poem and in order to establish some context in terms of the poet's own career and the poet's own style, as well as the poet's particular synthesis of natural beauty as well as universal and mythic identity. I will first read another poem, short poem, which Hughes published in his first collection of poetry. This poem is titled The Negro Speaks of Rivers. This poem has some features that it shares with the poem titled Proem, which I read in my earlier lecture on Hughes and which opened Hughes's first collection of poetry, The Weary Blues. In that poem titled Proem, Hughes introduces the speaker of his poems as a Negro and announces the particular historical as well as universal reasons why he wants to be considered as such. In this poem also, the Negro speaks of rivers. In this poem also, the speaker speaks of himself as inhabiting some sort of a similar sort of a universal identity. One person cannot have lived through such diverse historical times. Nonetheless, the speaker is claiming an identity. The speaker is claiming that the people who lived in these different times, different individuals, are part of one universal identity. That identity is that of race, but it's not only of race. It is of race that is united across historical periods because of certain kinds of experiences. So just like in Proem, the Negro identifies with people and slaves and workers ranging from Egypt to George Washington. Similarly, the experience of working as slaves, the experience of undertaking hard labor, combined with the historical fact that many of these individuals who were enslaved and who undertook or were forced to undertake hard labor were in fact of darker skin, were in fact black. These two things combine to give the poet the ability to claim that he is part of this identity. He is part of a historical self. He is not just an individual, he is part of a historical self. So, this is how Hughes writes. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. So already we are witnessing the poet justifying a particularly tall and somewhat incredible claim. Uh, the first claim is simple enough: I have known rivers. It's a simple enough claim for anyone to make that they know rivers. Then the poet deepens that claim, makes a little more ambitious claims. The poet says, I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. So rivers are in fact older than human beings because rivers, water bodies are part of the geology of Earth, which in fact predates the origin of life and human civilization. So rivers are older than human beings, and the poet claims that because he knows these water bodies, these natural things that are in fact older than human beings, he himself has grown older than human beings. In fact, if not he himself, then something of his personality, which is, he names it in the third line, his soul. The poet claims, my soul has grown deep like the rivers. Now, this is a somewhat tall claim because the poet says that he has undertaken some sort of a spiritual or emotional or cultural transformation because of his reflection on rivers, the historical evolution of the earth, and the history of which rivers are a part and of which human beings are also a part, although much smaller. That is to say, human beings are younger than rivers. Rivers are much older. So because the poet has been reflecting on this deep geological history, the poet is able to claim that his soul has grown deep. Right? Then the poet gives us some examples of what he's talking about. Why should we believe that his soul has grown deep? Then the poet says, I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers. So again, a similar sort of a historical survey is provided, all the way from Euphrates. Right? The Euphrates is the river that is the source and the foundation of one of the oldest human civilizations, the Mesopotamian civilization. Then the poet says that he built his hut near the Congo, right? Another river, which in the 20th century was exploited by Belgians, right? Belgians who extracted ivory and used the labor of enslaved black people to do that. Then ancient Egypt, right, looked upon the Nile. These are all rivers which are the sites of the ancient human civilizations. Rivers enable human beings to create life, to create community, to sustain life, to create the conditions on which life can be sustained, on which art, culture, education, consciousness can flourish. Right? Now, these are all instances of powerful rivers which have sustained powerful civilizations. The fourth river is the nearest to the context in which Hughes is writing. The Mississippi River in the southern part of the US, in the state of Mississippi, which is infamous for its racism, for the ownership of slaves, and for its Confederate role in the American Civil War. And indeed, Hughes refers to the American Civil War and Abraham Lincoln's role in the Civil War. Just a brief context, Abraham Lincoln reconciled these two sides and fought for the abolition of slavery, decided to take a stand against the Confederate States, and risked his life and career by supporting legislation in the US Supreme Court which finally ended up abolishing slavery. So it is this river also which Hughes includes in his historical survey of ancient rivers which have sustained powerful civilizations. But there's a catch here. The catch is the civilization is powerful, the river is ancient, but there is an inequality. The people who work, who do the labor of sustaining these civilizations, and the people who enjoy the most benefits or the comforts of these civilizations are not the same. In most cases, the people who do the work happen to be less free, they happen to be enslaved, they happen to be less powerful, and they also happen to have darker skin. They happen to be black or African. So the poet's ability in surveying this wide historical range is also to say that across these civilizations, one thing was common, which is the black person and the African American citizen was exploited in all of these civilizations. And then further, he also explains that in the last American context, slavery was abolished very, very recently. And until it was abolished, the same situation continued. The same racial inequality continued. So, the presence of racial inequality as a universal commonality to all of these civilizations, what does that mean? What does that do for the speaker of the poem? It gives the speaker of the poem the claim to a universal identity. Of course, one part of that universal identity is that of negritude. The poet is affirming his identity not just as having black skin color, but as part of a community of people all over the world who have been oppressed, who have been forced to make a living under unequal, unfair, unjust circumstances. This is part of Hughes's socialist thinking as well as his ideas of negritude. Additionally, the poet also makes a universal claim about the ancient nature of rivers and how his soul has grown deep like the rivers. In fact, that is the last line. The poet ends by saying, "My soul has grown deep like the rivers." What does it mean? It means, on one hand, that the poet is enriched by his knowledge of this deep and rich history of both human civilization being organized and built and sustained by rivers, but also the commonality that all these human civilizations exploited people with dark skin and especially Africans. That knowledge, that historical knowledge, inspires the poet's soul, or at least makes the poet conscious that he has a soul. And one defining feature of this soul is that it is as old as the rivers. So the point of this line, "My soul has grown deep like the rivers," is that the poet is connected as an individual to people across history, people the poet does not know. The people the poet cannot have known because they lived and died much earlier. But despite their lack of physical proximity, despite their lack of familiarity through bloodline, it is their racial identity which connects them. And this soul is actually the soul of the African American community. In fact, the larger African identity which connects people all over the world, despite their migration, forced transportation through the Middle Passage, and slavery. So the river then emerges as an unshakable, natural, geological symbol of both human oppression as well as human identity. Oppression, why? Because in all of these civilizations, black people were oppressed. But it is also a sign of identity. It is also a sign of hope. It is also a sign of, it's also an opportunity for creating solidarity, supporting and caring for each other, and building a more just society in the future. Why or how? If people recognize that the experience of being black, the experience of enslavement, the experience of working without much compensation, if people recognize that these experiences connect them, help them form a community, they can unite, they can create representation for themselves in democratic politics. Through these acts, they can actually improve the social conditions of black people. So that is the rich possibility that Langston Hughes is inaugurating through the use of the word soul, and by saying that a historical knowledge of the oppression of black people across human civilization has enriched the poet's soul. So, now that poem was written in 1927. Let us now move on to another poem which has a very rich connection with the vocabulary of this poem. This poem is titled The Bitter River. This was published in the year 1942, and in the words of Hughes, this poem is dedicated to the memory of two individuals. Who are they? Charlie Lang and Ernest Green, each 14 years old when lynched together beneath the Shibuya Bridge over the Chickasaw River in Mississippi. So this was in October 1942. Okay, in Mississippi, by a river, two 14-year-old boys were lynched, Charlie Lang and Ernest Green. So it is very similar to a typical elegy. An elegy is written commemorating the lives of two or one or two individuals or many individuals, but usually one. In a typical conventional elegy, the poet memorializes the life of one individual who has recently passed away. In this poem, the structure of the elegy or some of the occasions for the elegy are preserved because it is about two people who have recently passed away. But it's also different because it is more public. It's not about one person but two. It is not about people who were known personally to the poet. Rather, the poet feels an ethical compulsion to commemorate, to memorialize these deaths. The reason for that is not because the poet knew these individuals personally, but rather because the poet feels connected to these two individuals through this history of race, through the history of the African soul that Hughes has been describing in this poem about rivers. There is the identity of negritude. There is the identity of being black. There is the identity of experiencing the world in a different way because someone is black. So this is a poem that is channeling a sort of black life consciousness. And it is through that consciousness of sharing an identity that the poet feels the compulsion to memorialize the deaths of these two individuals as if they were known to the poet. Okay, so that's the context. Let us now read the poem. There is a bitter river flowing through the south. Too long has the taste of its water been in my mouth. There is a bitter river, dark with filth and mud. Too long has its evil poison poisoned my blood. Now, these two stanzas, what do they do? The poet repeats certain lines, refrains, frequent refrains. This, as I mentioned, is part of the convention of the blues song. The poet repeats a key line again and again in order to both convey something that is of crucial importance, but also to create a musical effect, in order to draw the audience in order to give the audience a comfortable and familiar and safe space. So repetition creates an intimate, shared, comfortable space. Now, the line that's repeated is, there is a bitter river. And another line that's repeated is, another phrase that's repeated is, too long. So there is a bitter river, and the poet claims that the contents of this river are bitter, the taste of its water is bitter, and it's bitter because it has poison, and that poison has entered the poet's blood. And further, the poet tells us that this river is bitter because it is dark with filth and mud. Okay. Now, further, the poet will probably give us some explanation of why the poet is saying so. I've drunk of the bitter river, and its gall coats the red of my tongue. Mixed with the blood of the lynched boys, from its iron bridge hung. Mixed with the hopes that are drowned there in the snake-like hiss of its stream, where I drank of the bitter river that strangled my dream. The book studied, but useless, tool handled, but unused, knowledge acquired, but thrown away, ambition battered and bruised. So we'll stop there and reflect on the insights that the speaker of Hughes' poem is beginning to share with us. So the poet says that he has drunk of the bitter river. Why would the poet have drunk of this bitter river? Now, a literal meaning of this sentence is that while a river flows down the stream from place to place, often the same water can be used for different purposes. Filtered, cleaned, processed, desalinated, etc., etc. There are a lot of things that can be done with water as it flows. So because water flows, it cannot be contained and commodified and objectified. It's possible for different places along the stream of the river to be able to make use of the water in different ways. So it's possible that at a certain location downstream, the water from this river might be filtered and supplied for drinking. So that is one very obvious and literal sense in which the poet has drunk of the river by whose side these two boys were lynched. But there is a deeper philosophical and metaphorical sense in which the poet has drunk of the bitter river. The poet has drunk of the bitter river because the poet has assimilated some ideas of this white supremacist ideology. The society in which the poet lives, works, operates, is educated, the society in which the poet earns his living as a poet, writing poems, getting published, receiving awards, earning his living. That society is a white supremacist society. It has some very deep assumptions, underlying assumptions about the inferiority and the lack of value of black lives. So the poet has drunk of the bitter river and is in some ways poisoned by it. This poem, while it is a critique of white supremacy, obviously, it is also in some ways a product of the poet's education and assimilation within that white supremacist culture. And the poet says that the culture in which he operates is informed by the death, the violence inflicted on, and the suffering of black people. And this suffering filtered into the water of the culture in which he lives has strangled his dream. The book studied but useless, tool handled but unused, knowledge acquired but thrown away, right? So what he's saying here is education and work. These are two important things that everyone acquires in order to succeed. Uh, Everyone pursues a good education in order to get a good job. Both of these things are promised to all Americans, but Black Americans or African Americans find that this is a hollow promise. Uh, Educational institutions were segregated, and recruitment or employment in professional bodies was also segregated, and most jobs were denied to African American people. High paying, white collar, intellectual labor oriented jobs were denied. Only physical labor, jobs requiring manual work, were open to African American individuals. So, this is a very literal case of ambition battered and bruised. Further, Hughes writes, "O water of the bitter river, with your taste of blood and clay, you reflect no stars by night, no sun by day. The bitter river reflects no stars. It gives back only the glint of steel bars, and dark, bitter faces behind steel bars. The Scottsboro boys behind steel bars, Lewis Jones behind steel bars, voteless sharecropper behind steel bars, the labor leader behind steel bars, the soldier thrown from a Jim Crow bus behind steel bars, the 15-cent mugger behind steel bars, the girl who sells her body behind steel bars, and my grandfather's back with its ladder of scars. Long ago, the whip and steel bars. The bitter river reflects no stars." So this stanza is again a powerful and compressed history of the racial experience of the American 20th century. What was the key defining feature of the racial experience of 20th century America? The process of the mass incarceration of Black people. So again, a brief history lesson will not be out of place. After the abolition of slavery, the period of Reconstruction began. And soon after, in the early 20th century, several southern states found ways to ensure that the racial discrimination of the time of slavery was continued despite the abolition of slavery. How? Through segregation, through laws which were known as the Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow was the name of a notorious and infamous lawmaker. And after Jim Crow, the era became known as the Jim Crow era, the early 20th century. It was also described as a way of continuing slavery by other means. So, one very common means by which slavery was continued after the legal abolition of slavery was through prisons. Black people were incarcerated, that is, imprisoned in record numbers, unprecedented numbers. Among some of the excuses that were used to imprison Black people were the war on drugs. Right? But even before that, a lot of Black people were incarcerated for petty crimes, crimes that might have been neglected or with a fine or a warning. But in the case of many Black people, they were imprisoned. This is the long list that the stanza provides of individuals, some named by names, and some individuals described through their profession. Most of these individuals are working class. They don't have much money. They don't have much influence in society. Some of them might have received respect if they were white, like the soldier. But all of them, and even the key sentence here, the 15-cent mugger behind steel bars. 15 cents is 15% of a dollar, right? So a very, very small amount. Someone who can steal that much money shows how poor and how desperate a situation they're in. And even this person, the person who stole 15 cents, was put behind steel bars. So it is this history, it is this reality of the mass incarceration of black people that the bitter river reflects. So it's a very powerful image. The poet looking at the river, expecting to see stars, but seeing instead steel bars, seeing instead the imprisonment of people from his community. And a lot of people, and immediately the poet connects this mass incarceration to literal slavery. When the poet ends the list of people who are imprisoned by referring to his, or by remembering his grandfather. And such a powerful line, the poet writes, "And my grandfather's back with its ladder of scars, long ago, the whip and steel bars." The poet reflects on what it is that the society tells people like him. Wait, be patient is what the poet says you say. That is, the average reader of the poem, who through their education might be able to understand the perspective of most white people. Wait, be patient, your folks will have a better day. But the swirl of the bitter river takes your words away. Work, education, patience will bring a better day. So this is the promise that American society gives or provides to black people. What is the promise? Work. Work hard and wait for the rewards. But the river, in a way, helps the oppressed community by washing those words away, by dismissing those words away, because it is in the river that the poet can see that these promises are false. Working hard, being obedient, is not going to change the fate of an African American person as long as they live in a society where their lives are considered so cheap. Okay? There's one more stanza left, and I will conclude our study of Langston Hughes with a brief discussion of this stanza of the poem The Bitter River in the next lecture. Thank you.